must be skeptical of absolutely everything. Above all, this is a war of propaganda.
Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate.
We only need to use the word faith when there isn't any evidence.
I presume you've got faith in your wife. Is there any evidence for that?
Yes, plenty of evidence. I
strongly resist the idea that archaeology is a science. These days, academics are driven by the need to publish research papers.
Now, of course I am minimising my tax, and if anybody in this country doesn't minimise their tax, they want their heads ripped. Because as a government, I can tell you, you're not spending it that well that we should be donating extra.
The easy answer is this. If we continue to send our children to Caesar for their education, we need to stop being surprised when they come home as Romans.
So, welcome to Fringe Frequencies, another episode 5, I believe. Episode 5, Cody?
6?
6, 5 or 6?
Maybe.
We'll post it anyway, so we'll get
KJV
there.
only was like 2 parts.
It feels like it was ages ago, KJV only, that subject anyway. So tonight, we are pleased to announce our first big-time guest, and we really, really appreciate him coming on to our podcast to discuss the topic for tonight, which is homeschooling. And our guest tonight is Terry Harding, from manager of the Australian Christian Homeschooling of Australia. And I'm going to let him introduce himself and his background and what he stands for, and how long he's been associated with homeschooling. And we're going to go through tonight a number of different topics around schooling in general, homeschooling, private Christian education in general, the acceleration of that over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, and how, I guess you could say, Christians or just Australians and New Zealanders in general, whatever in the United States, and the impact of the last sort of 3 years of lockdowns and what that's sort of done to schooling and accelerating this need for education within the homes, and parents sort of feeling like, hey, look, the state is sort of failing, or even to some extent the impact of government upon private Christian schools. So, Terry, I've introduced, obviously, your organisation, and thank you so much for coming on board. I'd just like if you could give us a little bit of an intro into who you are and what you stand for, and a little bit about your career, and perhaps we can go into broaden out from there.
Thanks very much, Jason. Hi, Cody, and hi, everybody. Yes, my name's Terry Harding, and born last millennium. I've been married to Diane for 45 years, and we've had the pleasure of having 4 boys and 1 daughter, so 5 children. And we have home educated them from the preschool level right through to year 12, and they have gone off and done extra studies and are now productively operating in their various communities. And so I've been very interested in homeschooling right from my early times of career. I was at Sydney University studying to be a teacher back in the 70s. So that's a while ago.
Yeah.
And during that time, I found out about Christian curriculum. And so when it came time to start the formal education of our eldest son at the age of 5, we wanted to use Christian curriculum. We weren't located near a Christian school, so we thought, let's start homeschooling. And so thus we did. And so people asked, why did you start this crazy thing called homeschooling? And our response was, well, we are a Christian couple. We want to raise our children in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ, and we just believe that that's an integral part of their formal education. So we wanted Christian curriculum. However, after about a year or so of homeschooling, and we'd learned about the ways of homeschooling and the advantages, we changed our story. We hadn't changed our position as Christians. We still wanted Christian education for all of our kids. But we learned that the relationship we were able to develop with our children over an extended period of time more than most Aussie parents, because they delegate the formal education of their kids to schooling. We said, look, the reason we're homeschooling now is just for close and intimate relationships with our kids. So anyway, that's the start of the story. And we carried through with the homeschooling. In 1994, I was asked to come on board with Australian Christian Academy as an academic consultant. And then I became the principal of it in 95 and have been in that role as manager of Australian Christian homeschooling since 1995.
Wow.
So that's a little bit about it. I realised there was a lot of opposition. It was a time of where homeschooling was in its infancy, and I decided I needed to advance my own understanding. So I started a master's degree at Queensland University of Technology and researched homeschooling. And later on, in the early 2000s, I did a doctorate looking at the roles of parents who home educate. That's a little bit of background. Also, during that time, what sprung out of our homeschooling, because when I took over, there were around 2,000 children nationwide, and I started doing national tours around each of the states and territories of Australia, and it quickly grew to 4,000. And so the board said, oh, look, can you set up non-government distance education? So I started doing a little of that, and what's come out of it over the years is 12 Christian schools in 5 states, and 4 of those Christian schools also have a distance education provision, which is Christian distance education. So that's my experience as a homeschooler with my wife and my 5 kids, as a researcher, Master of Education and doctoral studies, and of course managing Australian Christian homeschooling. And interspersed within that over periods, for example, I spent 2 years in Victoria recently assisting a Christian school as their principal till we got a new one. I was also principal of 4 schools, Christian schools, in various states of Australia. That's a little bit of background. And now I have 10 grandkids.
Wow.
So the Harding family is growing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Just going to, interesting just to hone on, you said 1995 was when you became the manager of this organisation that you partner with now. That's almost 30 years. Yeah. It's quite an achievement.
I didn't get these grey hairs for nothing.
Well, yeah, hey, look, I'm 41, my hair's going, and almost grey. So
you guys got full heads compared to me. Trust me.
I'm going to be midnight oil by the time I'm in towards my 70s. So around that, I recall around that time, around the sort of mid 90s. I recall growing up in New Zealand that there were a few smattering of kids we knew of in our church, maybe 2 or 3 that were homeschooled. And it's funny you mentioned you sort of had opposition back during that time. And it's funny because I sort of parallel opposition, or perhaps what you were saying, with kind of the stigma that homeschool kids, they're not socialized well, they're a bit awkward, maybe they don't, I remember all the things that were said, maybe they don't get as much better education as public or, private school kids. Can you sort of, relate to that or give us, I guess, a bit of your experience with that during that period?
And if you can.
Certainly. Those are 2 key issues which are largely myths of the uninitiated. People who don't know much about homeschooling will make that assumption. Now, implied in that assumption is that great academics come out of schooling. Great socialisation comes out of schooling. And so I often ask people, let's just talk about, firstly, the socialisation one. That's the common one still.
Yeah.
When people talk to me about socialisation, I say, what do you think socialisation is? And mostly they don't know. So that kind of makes them think a little bit, which is a bit of a challenge. So anyway, I then quote to them some of the world's leading experts on what is socialization. I'll see if I've got a copy. I think I have. And largely, this is quoting a well-known sociologist and psychologist, and from the Blackwell Encyclopedia of Social Psychology. And this is Durkin speaking, and he says that socialization is the process whereby people acquire the rules of behavior and systems, beliefs and attitudes that equip a person to function effectively as a member of a particular society. And then he goes on to say, largely it's teaching people to participate in the daily routines which immerse them in the values of their community. Now, my take on that was that if I were to just isolate my children in 13 years with the same age peers in an artificial institution, that, yeah, maybe socialization's occurring, a certain type of socialization's occurring, but the world is much wider and broader. And so what Durkin says in the Encyclopedia of Social Psychology makes a lot of sense to me. I used to respond to people when they said about socialization. I said, well, you should see my phone bill and the things that we do and the number of Ks we rack up on our Tarago. But the point is that people, when they use that pretty well, like a bit of an attack on this strange thing called homeschooling by questioning the social development of their kids who are homeschooled, they really are not aware of homeschooling, so they're uninitiated. So it's okay to play around with that one. And my children had plenty of great social experiences in local footy teams and netball teams and choir and chess club and swimming club. And when we first started, I guess we were victims of this assumption about socialization. And so we took our kids to too many things. And so we just had to peel back and pray about it and say, well, Lord, what sort of activities do you want our kids to participate in? And of course, church and all those great things, youth group. So the kids were well socialized. All of my kids are good communicators. And anyway, I don't want to gild the lily about my own kids. They're just normal kids. Well, they're grown adults now. They're not perfect, just like everybody else. But the socialization thing was just a myth that needed to be busted. And I think the global research does that and explains that homeschoolers are fine, just like normal members of the community. With respect to the academics, it's the same thing. And I've done lots of research into, can the little ones learn to read? Can they learn to count? Can the big ones understand Pythagoras' theorem and science and all those good things that God has put out there for them to learn? And can they get into uni? And I can give you some stats on that later. The answer is not a problem. In fact, quite the opposite, that the global research is saying that homeschool kids are doing, and this is a quote from Dr. Brian Ray, as well as, if not better than, their age peer counterparts.
So, okay, you're going to ask a question?
Oh, yeah, no, because I was going to say, with your extensive experience in the field, like with the exposure that you've had to these children and to these families, I mean, you would have the points of data to draw from in your own experience to determine for yourself, okay, am I seeing a big disparity in the social any social issues in these children or in these groups? So you would say you've certainly witnessed no distinguishable feature, if not, you would say homeschool individuals are just as well integrated into a sort of social society, or however you want to phrase it. They're just as quote unquote as normal as the myth might say. They're not normal, so they're just as normal as schooled kids, or if not more. More adjusted to society. What would you say to that? If because I'm asking, in your experience, what have you seen?
Yeah, well, and it's just not what I see anecdotally. It's also, really formal research, psych
Yeah.
tests, all those sorts of things that researchers seem to love to do. But the answer is that those children, within my experience within Australian Christian homeschooling, we've got the whole gamut of personality and types of children. We've got, at one level, we've got children that have graduated and are now working at NASA. Just high level kids who have just gone so well and bloomed nicely, did university, got these high flying career paths. And at the other level, we've got children with learning difficulties and children who have learning challenges. It's called, in statistics, it's called the bell curve, if you know about that bell curve.
Yeah.
But in the middle of that bell curve is the majority of kids, average kids, doing their learning. What's different about them is that they are in an environment where they can be relaxed rather than bullied or have to conform to peer pressure or all those social factors that we see in age peer classroom-based schooling. And I'm not knocking it. It's just a phenomenon that we accept in Australia. The majority of people delegate their kids to the Minister of Education to go to a state or a non-state school. But having said that, to have the children learning in a relaxed and safe atmosphere and going out into the broader community as a natural thing, like part of your maths is not just learning the theory of 2 + 2 is 4, but you're engaged with a mother buying the groceries, and that's part of your lifestyle as a learning lifestyle. So kids are quite well adjusted. The thing that I also want to point out, and I probably shouldn't go on too long.
No, please. Please do.
Often with children who've been bullied or have anxiety, psychological issues, teenagers who are school resistant because of various reasons, they will be brought into homeschooling and learn to just relax, de-stress, and to be themselves. So that's a very important psychological factor in the social development of kids.
Yeah, just being able to, we probably both remember like the days of schooling where when you left the school grounds, bullying stopped, and obviously that's changed with the advent of technology. It doesn't stop at the gate. It sort of carries on. So there's all a range of different distractions that were always there, but now they've literally been blown up with the advent of technology and that sort of reach. That's one thing that's definitely changed. Just going back to something you said before, which was you sort of touched on it really briefly, which is not knocking schools where you've got multiple students and people that can't necessarily homeschool. Would you say one of the challenges, because the way that I look at it is, I'm an optimist, and I do find that the general population, when you, to a degree, at least with, let's just take education. Let's take education, for example, and the stories of learning difficulties and bullying, they are rife. They're rife within public schooling, private Christian education. So I have this tendency to believe in the logical ability of parents to then see some of the benefits of homeschooling to eliminate some of these things. But the biggest obstacle I see is not so much that parents couldn't get into wider groups and networks to be able to homeschool their own kids, but that the one parent working families now has changed. So from the 1980s, maybe early 1990s, when you could afford to have mum or dad, and at that particular time it was predominantly dad going to work and mum staying home, that's changed. Things are a lot more expensive, and so then, but you'd say, oh, okay, but you're sending your kids to a private Christian school, that's $25,000 a year. There's a point to that, but obviously there are some subsidies available. But I mean, that's like $500 a week, and mum staying home is probably less, $1,000 a week or whatever it is. So it sort of balances itself out. It's still better for mum to be at work under today's sort of expense guidelines than and have the kids at a private education cost wise. So Do you see that playing a part in I guess some Christian families or just families in general? Maybe they've got past some of the stigma or those aspects of homeschooling. You know what? This is actually a great idea, but we can't afford to. We can't afford to have someone home. Do you think that plays a part as well? Because we'll get into that eventually. We've seen that massive uptick over the last 2-3 years in the Western world for homeschooling, and we'll get into the reasons why. But at the same time, do you think it would be greater if the financial constraints weren't there?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. People start homeschooling not for frivolous reasons. There are very serious reasons that they say, well, we're going to educate our kids ourselves. We're not going to send them off to the free school or to the fee school. We're not going to put them on a bus and say bye-bye. We're going to do this ourselves. Secondly, they're going to embrace a single income status, as you've already said, and that's unlike their next door neighbours, who are largely, in the built-up areas around Australia and capital cities. There, many and most families are dual income, and their taxes are paying for the state system's school, and on top of that, they're paying dollars to homeschool their own kids. So there's a double hit there in terms of paying for education, and as I said, as a single income family. So look, it's hard to say what it would be if the economy were more conducive to family living. But all I can say is, families who take up this challenge do not do it frivolously, and they do it after considering serious matters.
They place the children and their future above, let's say, some extra income, and they perhaps bring their family back to a place where they're being perhaps a lot more frugal than their neighbours would be with maybe a second income kind of thing. And it's funny you mention that, because the families that I recall who did homeschooling, they were fairly modest. There was a range of families with homeschool, and I've seen a range of I've seen predominantly better outcomes than not, and I would say 80-90% better outcomes with homeschooling. I've seen some curriculums which you may be familiar with, which is ACE, Accelerated Christian Education. We were involved in that at school. The Christian education was thrown out, and we actually had ACE at a Christian school. But I've also know those who've had it at a home base. And again, when I hear to knock other organisations, it was fairly simplistic and easy, multi-choice type stuff. And I don't know that I've seen amazing results from that particular type of, I don't know if it's simplistic education, but it was quite simple. But I think as well that the outcomes, to some degree, are determined by the parents, and I guess their vigilance at home as well, regardless of the organisation and the types of curriculum. Would you say that has an impact as well, the vigilance of the parents?
Well, the ACE curriculum is really at the cutting edge of what educational reformers are talking about now. It's called explicit instruction.
Okay.
Rather than making education difficult, it's quite important to say, this is what you're going to learn, this is what you'll be tested on, so let's get learning. And again, my experience is kids going through that system, and we use it in Australian Christian homeschooling. We also have online enhancements and other issues, but that's not the only curriculum input for homeschoolers. They've got the garden down the back. They've joined the gym club. It's as diverse as the numbers of families that are homeschooling.
Life basically.
But you will see over the next 5 years, and it's already happening for those of us that are in touch with educational theory, etc., a very important pushback on explicit instruction, even in classrooms.
So there's honestly, Terry, there's so much I want to ask you, and sorry, I wasn't sure there after the interruption there, which is with the thing, if you were finished with regards to the three types of schooling. So there was the structured packages, And
Yeah,
and
this-
I'm yep, and I'm assuming the
Yeah,
explicit.
the structured format, which it provides tools that parents can use, and my wife and I used that particular structured method because we didn't want to go and reinvent the wheel. We wanted a good foundational curriculum that was biblical and that would be a good classical foundational education, because we didn't want to go and have to create things. We wanted to pour our energies into our children. So if someone's done a great job creating a curriculum that's acceptable, great, use it, and then add those things. And the biggest thing, and I'll get more to it later, the biggest thing that homeschool parents have to grow their kids' cognitive and social development and their physical development is their love and their language. Remember that God spoke and he created, and we create things in our kids as we talk with them. So anyway, that's the structured format. The second type of homeschooling is what I call the eclectic format, where people just cobble together different books, and of course the internet runs for all homeschools, whether you're structured or whether you're an eclectic type, and you just put it all together yourself as a parent. And that's the thing Diane and I didn't want to do. We just wanted to get something that was good and pour ourselves in. And the third aspect of, or format of homeschooling, is called either unschooling or natural learning, where it's really child-directed learning, where the child's interests are pursued and followed along a particular path of learning. So the three: the structured, the eclectic, and the natural learning.
Which is
They are the homeschooling methods.
Which is the most popular you find in Australia or in the fields that you've been in?
No one knows. You can't say, because what that question, Cody's tied into is how many people are homeschooling, and how many are doing the structured, how many are doing the eclectic, how many, and the facts are we do not know how many people are out there homeschooling, which is quite exciting to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so just a couple of things that came to mind, Terry. One was with regards to you said that you were a principal in 4 Christian schools, so outside of homeschooling, and I sort of touched on something before we were talking earlier, before we started this session. And so I'll just give you, I don't want this to be about my story, but I'll give you my background from schooling as a young child from the age of 5 and 6, and what I've seen in Christian schooling, at least from a kid's perspective, an adult's perspective, and a parent's perspective. When I had Christian schooling in New Zealand at the age of 6.5, I got brought up in a non-integrated Christian school in New Zealand. It was called Homeschooling Christian School, and at that time, it was very expensive, even for 1980, would have been 1987, 98 when I went there. So non-integrated schooling was very expensive. So my parents really busted themselves to send us there. But I guess I had a great experience. They had their own curriculum, which was fantastic from my remembered experience. But then they moved to ACE a little bit later on in the piece. And then at the time there was a big thing about having non-denominational kids in the school and kids from different denominations. So that sort of accelerated a bit of a change, and the school's no longer around anymore. But look, I guess I just wanted to see if you can touch on something that has been something that I think I've seen and has been my experience. At least from where I'm sitting, I find the reasons that I see homeschooling so attractive now, at least from my perspective, if I was having my children again, my children this year will be 21, 19 and 17 respectively. My last child, we homeschooled him for about 2 years at the sort of latter stage. I start to see that Christian schooling, private Christian education, and I'm not having a go at the teachers or the principals, because there's encroaching regulation. Teachers are not in control of boards, of school board associations, and I guess how much funding they let in and what they have to let away to get that funding from the government. But I seem to see, at least from my angle, that we've gone from Christian schools where, rather than just having some vague letter from your pastor to say, yep, great, we're Christians, our kids can come here, or having a 30-40% policy of Christians to non-Christian and being loose, it's pretty much, without trying to be vulgar about it, it almost seems like a free-for-all. And the culture is influencing the schools more than the schools are influencing the culture. And I understand that parents are sort of, they're so busy with their lives. We're all so busy. You send your kids to school and there's this pressure on teachers to not only teach them, but almost to be almost like second parents. But I've been a big advocate, and now I understand some of the arguments from the 90s that the school boards had there where they didn't want to integrate with other denominations. It wasn't so much exclusion. It was that it lost its purity in the sense of there are between the different denominations of Christian organizations, there are, you could say, for lack of a better way of saying it, it's a bit crude, differing standards. Parents parent differently on a Christian level. Arguably some are more loose than others, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome for the children, they're going to make their own decisions about how they live their life when they grow up. But the way that I see it is that Christian schools today, no disrespect to the Christian teachers who are really trying their hardest, or even the principals and the pressure that they're under, but I have seen Christian school boards increasingly seceding to more funding for more buildings and more this and more that over the Christian education and the center and foundation of what it's supposed to be. Am I seeing something? Am I completely wrong, or am I misguided? Am I seeing that wrong? And just be blunt about that too. I just want to see from your perspective, having been a principal in private schooling for principals and 4 times, but then coming into homeschooling, am I misguided there? Am I seeing something? Can you touch on that?
Well, sure, Jason. There's a lot of variation among schools, including among state schools. In Australia, we've got a brilliant system that sets up a brilliant opportunity to set up a brilliant school system. However, there are some problems that have emerged and have grown massively over the last, say, 30 years. Now, with respect to Christian schools, I was there learning my teaching ropes, if you could put it that way, in the 70s. And largely that wonderful Christian school movement was there as a discipleship or a disciple-making process, and very much committed in its infancy to helping kids grow in their spiritual walk with the Lord Jesus Christ. However, other people who necessarily weren't Christian but saw the value of a quality learning environment, the care, the love, the good academics, all of that, and they said, well, we want to buy into this as well. And so it became more popular, not just with parents who were committed to seeing their kids brought up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, but also other parents, well-intentioned, who just wanted to be a part of that good environment. And then the funding, as you probably know, and I've done a lot of research into that, the funding goes with the number of enrolments. And so there was the temptation to just, in some of the Christian schools, to just bring in more enrolments, grow the school, get more funding, and so it goes, like a self-perpetuating thing. Now, I'm not wanting to condemn that at all, because the different Christian schools have different functionality, but the more non-Christian influence you bring into your Christian school because of your enrolment policy, the more the culture can change. And so the question then arises, are the kids becoming more Christian, or are the kids coming in changing the culture of the school to be less Christian? So that's very important. But that's just speaking about the enrolment side of thing. Then you've got also the concept of your staffing and your leadership, your principal and your board. And certainly with the Christian schools that are in our group, we're committed to every staff member has to be a committed Christian, attending church, and operating in a behaviour that's Christian and biblically focused. But that still doesn't fix it, because I really would like to touch on what I consider the insidious model of education nationwide, and I lay that concern at the feet of the universities. Now, the universities have been infiltrated the last 40 years by the great walk of the Marxists through the institutions of the universities, the media, law, etc. And in particular, seeing tonight's talk, or today's talk, is just about education, I would focus upon the numbers of universities that we have in this country, and each one having a education faculty. Now, those education faculties have been completely taken over by leftist, neo-Marxist leadership, and there's been a capture, an ideological capture. Sorry for that, the big words.
No, especially in the humanities.
Yeah, oh, totally. And that's been a capture by these people, and that is training our teachers to be left-leaning and pro-Marxist, even if they don't realise it. And that then captures the next generation of kids. And that infects the whole of society, including the voting patterns for the next generation.
They're also arguably, just a comment on that, just while I remember, the universities are arguably also a conduit for banks to write big loans, or the government to write big loans. Because you think about it, right? Logically, an 18-year-old with no experience has a great business idea, goes to Commonwealth Bank or any bank in particular. I mean, any bank, not Combank. Is, hey, look, I've got a great business idea, but I need $60,000. Could you perhaps look at my business idea and write me a check? No. Hey, I'm going to university to study philosophy. Can I have $60,000? Oh, fantastic. Here, we'll write you a check. You see the contradiction?
Well, yeah, that's right, and that's the system. That's the system that we have in this nation, and it can be used to advantage too. That a person can have that loan, and the community pays, 2/3 of that the expense for that education, and they pay it back through the tax system later on. So yeah, it is a loan system, and in fact, if the person does not earn above a threshold, it used to be 58,000. Once they graduate, they don't have to pay it back. I think that's a great opportunity for missionaries, as long as they're doing the right courses.
As long as they survive, as long as they survive the curriculum.
Oh,
well, that's right. And the problem we have here is that children not prepared for uni, having not a biblical worldview for thinking, going to these atheistic institutions, and learning the wrong way. This is a critical problem in Australia.
It's very interesting because I think, and what you're talking about is absolutely true, Terry. There's no doubt that there is, ever since sort of the sort of John Dewey system began, it was going to eventually, in my opinion, ultimately lead to a sort of Marxist position, or a sort of socialist sort of situation. I mean, like you said, you're kind of giving the children over to the government to teach them. That's effectively what you're doing. Or the Minister for Education in Australia, as you said. And I think that for myself, so I've got a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. The 5-year-old is currently in prep, and the 7-year-old is being homeschooled, my little girl. And it's interesting when you pointed out early on in your introduction that I don't think you used the term intimate. I don't think you used the term you wanted that sort of intimacy with regards to the teaching. Oh, okay, good. That's where I got it from. Good. But that for us, for myself and my wife, was very important. It's not doing it justice saying hands-on. It's not just that we wanted a hands-on approach to educating our own children, but we wanted to know what they were learning, to understand how they were learning, and at what stage of development they were at, how to better cater to them. And I guess that for us was the motivator, as I'm sure you're aware, is one of the key motivators, but also to keep them away from a clearly, and in my very biased opinion, a clearly non-biblical agenda, a clearly atheistic position. And I find I wouldn't feel comfortable sending my daughter to a university unless I knew she was strong in the Lord, unless I knew that she was ready to be basically encompassed about by enemies, So I was going to ask, sorry, I haven't asked the question very clearly, but I was going to ask, do you find that the advent of COVID, what sort of happened there, caused an increase in homeschooling? Or do you believe the political agendas that seem to be coming through are pushing people more towards homeschooling? And if there has been an increase in homeschooling at all, I believe there has been, but would you attribute it more to the lockdowns and the position that people had with regards to things like the vaccine? Or do you believe it has actually been motivated politically?
Great question. And I was looking to answer that question middle of last year. And I put out a survey among Australian Christian homeschooling families asking the question, why are you homeschooling? Why do you choose to do this thing? And so to answer your question briefly, it's families. I found that there were six major categories as to why parents were choosing this homeschooling. And I just sent this out to our families all over the country, the ones who had been homeschooling at length with us, some of the new families, so that it was a beautiful mix of different types of families. Now, the 6 areas that they responded to was, I'll give you the 6 and then maybe just go into a little bit of detail.
Please.
And probably tell you what they literally said, because I quoted it. So the 6 areas why they chose homeschooling, because of government policies, number 1, because of the school environment. Now, those 2, government policies and school environment, were negative issues, and I'm calling them push factors. They actually literally pushed people out of the Australian the Australian schooling system. Now, then there were 4 pull factors that pulled families and kids into homeschooling, and they were the quality of the home environment, the role of a parent, parents wanted to be parents, religious reasons, and specific concerns for the child, special needs, whether they were highly gifted kids or kids with learning difficulties or bullying and those sorts of issues. So they're the 4 that, and could summarize as push factors and pull factors. And I further summarize the push factors were around the idea of an institution, governments and schooling. Okay. And hey, I'm the last person to knock schooling. If it's done well, go for it. Fantastic. And parents, if they want schooling, they've got to look for good schools. We can talk about that later. But there were 2 institutions, the government and schooling. The pull factors were all about the family home. I'll read them out again. My home environment, my role as a parent, my religious beliefs, and my child has special needs. So I'll pull them and draw them close. So they're the big picture reasons for choosing homeschooling. I'll just pull a couple of quotes because I've got hundreds of them.
Fantastic.
Because we had lots and lots of responses. Government's policies, I cited that one first. One parent said radical gender theory, critical race theory, leftist woke political agenda forced the children out of the school. Another one said, now not anti-government as well, because God has ordained government, and Paul writes about good government.
Amen.
It's not about anarchy here. But if your government is...
That's an interesting point amongst Christians.
What's that?
Oh, just the, Christians should not be, strictly speaking, anti-government. I think you'll find, especially in America and some of the southern states, it's more not so much about anti-government. It's more about this independence streak, which I think it can push a little bit too far. But sorry, I just started to have a little chuckle to myself on that point. Yeah.
Well, the Bible's clear that God has ordained government, but it has its limits, and we know from Magna Carta, 1215 AD. Since then, we've seen limited government, limited sphere. But one parent said zero trust in government education. Racial and sexual education materials are blasphemies, and on and on and on it goes. Another parent said the education system is morally bankrupt and destroying Christian values. Others talked about teaching and learning. Another one said, my son who was in kindergarten informed us that they were showing drag queens reading stories and videos, and on and on. Wow. Now, this is not characteristic of all schooling, so don't get me wrong. But for these parents in their kids' schools, that's what was happening, and that was pushing them out. And one parent wrote, I had no other choice because of these philosophical fads and ideologies that were just atheistic, Marxist, contrary to Christianity, contrary to the existence that there might be some truth, all of these negative things. So that's home environment. School environment was about bullying, kids being suicidal. Now, these are extreme examples, but that's why they left, and that's what pushed them out. And the schools being secretive about negative activities in the school. One mum wrote and talked about her daughter being subjected to watching fist fights in the classroom and throwing chairs. Sorry about the negativity, guys, but this is what was the case.
No, it's yeah.
And look, I've got to say one other thing, because let's call a spade a spade. Right now, our Senate, that's the Australian Senate, is looking at the problems of disruptions in Australian classrooms. Now, for crying out loud, the Senate has an inquiry currently looking into that. That's so, how far we've gone. They're the push factors. The pull factors were things like my home environment has a safe environment. My home environment, I have flexible timing. My home environment gives more diversity. And this is a big one.
That's so ironic. You just said the home environment gives more diversity. That's ironic.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you're free. You have flexibility. And a big one was one-on-one teaching. Now, that's the beautiful thing that Diane and I experienced for our kids. It was just one-on-one, even though we had 5 kids. But in the school, and again, I'm not knocking school, it's just a fact, and it's a fact of numbers. We have one teacher, one adult, with 25 or more kids. Now, God has said, look, no, 2 adults to 1 child, to each child individually, different maths and different input. And I want to jump into, you tell me when to stop. I'll jump into a thing that I believe came out of my research in 2011 when I did the doctorate. And it's a phenomenon I'm calling the PED, the Parental Educational Dynamic. Now, by the parental educational dynamic, what I mean is the invisible faith-based relationship between the parent and the child that makes the parent the teacher. Now, I'm not talking about religious faith, although that's obviously very important to my wife and I, but it's that the child learns to trust mummy, to trust daddy, and that makes teaching easy. What happens there, and 2 examples, just quickly to cover this thing, because parents have taught the most difficult cognitive activity on the planet. That is, in Australia, to teach their children to speak the English language from scratch. Now, the PED, I'll give 2 examples. The first time we were in Hornsby Hospital, our eldest boy was born, and the first time we brought our son to my wife's breast, he had no idea what to do. No idea. And thankfully, there was a lady there who helped us. And she said, I'll just stroke his cheeks and push him on and all that. And suddenly, he got what he needed. He got warmth and nurture and etc. That was knowledge. The first time, he got the knowledge. The second time we brought him for a feed, honestly, he got within about a foot of my wife, and he lunged forward. That was faith. He learned first where I can get the nurture, and then after that it was by faith. I know I can get it. Another example would be if my son at the age of 3 said, "Daddy, what day is it?" And I might say, "It's Tuesday today, son." He doesn't know what a Tuesday looks like, smells like, tastes like. But because of our relationship, he trusts me so I can input that knowledge that today is Tuesday. So just an example of the parental educational dynamic that's in every parent. The difference between most parents and homeschooling parents is that homeschooling parents have much, much longer to create that faith-based parent-to-child relationship, and that builds very strong cognitives, very strong social development, very strong resilience.
I guess you could say, I mean, it creates a pretty unique bond as well when you're comparing a public schooling system or a child in public school versus a homeschool child, that they have that faith, that trust in their parent. You know, and I actually, you know, maybe that has, and I think you're definitely onto something. I'd love to read your doctor. I'd love to read it because I actually spoke to Jason about this earlier. I wanted to understand what your contribution was to the field, and that was certainly interesting because you think about delinquency in school, and a lot of it has to do with the parent-child relationship. Obviously, you know, this is not rocket science. We know that these issues are starting at home, not necessarily at school. So when I think about the parents who decide to homeschool, I believe that the relationship with their child is very important to them. You know, and I'm not saying that it's not important to parents who send their children to public school. I'm just saying you have that advantage with homeschooling to I guess, sort of create that bond, as you were saying. Can I ask, you know, would you say that homeschooling is becoming more and more of an accepted education system in the secular world because of the pandemic, because of these work? So I guess those 6 reasons, because you surveyed, I'm assuming, the ACHS. So if I could, you know, let's say you were surveying a secular group, would you think that they're
like conservative? Like, let's say, I was going to ask you about that. Like, let's say people who are conservative, because you see that push amongst people who are, they believe in God, but they're conservative. They have conservative values, natural law, all that kind of stuff. Is that kind of what you mean?
Not even that. Not even that. Like, okay. So my sister, I'm sorry, I'll give you a little backstory to my question, which is, you know, why is the secular world becoming more and more interested in homeschooling? Because I believe it is. I think Christians popularized it. I would say, but I could be wrong about that. I'm sure you could weigh in on that. But my sister, who is not Christian at all, she's quite not Christian at all. I'll leave it at that. And we'll say every time she looked into groups that she could involve her daughter in, who she considered homeschooling, they always had a Christian sort of leaning, or that they had Christian foundations, and yet. This was a few years ago she looked, and then she looked again recently, and there were far more secular homeschooling opportunities with terms of social groups. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think in the early days, Christians jumped on board with homeschooling because they have a philosophical framework. Whether they realise or not, they've got a reason for their values. They've got a purpose and a direction toward the things of God. And so homeschooling grew, and it was often, as you say, Cody, with a majority of Christians in various groups. However, others have looked and said, well, that's all right, I want a piece of that. And they've jumped in, irrespective of their philosophical or religious backgrounds. And so, my recent research has shown this exactly what you say, that people who don't have a religious position, but are still, they're human, and they have that desire to raise their children well and to be free thinking, and to not be subject to the ideologies and the fads and the anti-science and the anti-human and the anti-God for the Christian people. They don't want that, and so to
pseudo-tolerance. To pseudo-tolerance, this kind of like I said, you talk about free thinking, the stifling of, well, it's almost anti-science really in the secular world, and some people who aren't necessarily religious are seeing that as well. Would you say?
Well, we're seeing that today. Yeah. A denial of the obvious in terms of sexuality, in terms of gender, denial of science, denial of God's way. So and so parents are growing wise to that, and so like Australian Christian homeschooling has grown 62% over the last 3 years.
Wow.
And then I've done some unique research.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah, it is. And in every state and territory, parents who want to homeschool can register their kids as homeschoolers, so they don't be called upon as their children being truant. So a lot of homeschoolers do register with their state groups, their state education departments. A lot of homeschoolers do not, and so there's that choice. Anyway, so I've looked at just the ones that do register, and the numbers have skyrocketed post-COVID. So so you're right again, Cody. It's a growing factor, and you've got your traditional reasons that I've read out to you, but COVID escalated it.
I was going to say, as you were asking that question, so
it was the jab.
Well, not just that. I think that too, but I think just for 2020, 2021, two of my children. I mean, it virtually became, and no disrespect to this Christian school that we're going to, it was rife, it was everywhere. It became what I call cabbage school. School online, the learning became virtually nothing. And I think that coupled with the ideological stuff all happening, I mean, look, we're not going to. This is not the time to wade into the jab.
Oh no. Sorry, let me clarify. So
no. I know exactly what you meant. It was the restrictions,
the lockdowns.
The lockdowns. I understood what you meant, but it was the you could say restrictions upon movement, and obviously that divide between jab and unjabbed. And I don't think it's maybe I'm stepping over the mark here, but I don't think it would be a stretch to say that a lot of families who homeschool weren't in favour of some of the restrictions around obviously the medication and the sort of jab aspect of it. That being aside, the whole COVID just really exacerbated things that were already encroaching in 2020. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, look, I can back it up with data. Let me read this out. I hope you don't find it too boring. But I found just checking the number of homeschooling children who could be counted, and they're the ones that registered with the state, right? Not looking at the ones who didn't register, because it's unquantifiable. You don't know. But listen to this. Over the last 5 years, so I've got from 2018 to 2022, the number of homeschooled registered has grown by 110%. 110%. And the stats are quite amazing. New South Wales was 124%. Queensland 162%,
wow.
Victoria 112, I'm sorry, South Australia 86%, West Australia 73%, and Northern Territory 82%. So it really just boomed with COVID. Interesting, the data I recorded from parents in my survey, some parents were saying, we had our children home during the COVID time, and we just finally realised how little they had grown.
Yeah, I heard that so many times.
Me too.
We can do that.
Yeah.
So that was interesting response.
That was what I was talking about, right? So once Jules had the experience, my wife Juliet, once she had the experience of actually sitting with our daughter and was unfortunately forced to the position of homeschooling, I think not only for her but for other parents, it removed a lot of the fears. And also provided that experience. It's kind of like, well, some of them are going to like it. Some of them were going to like it, Yeah. And I'm glad that some did. I know a lot didn't. I certainly know a lot didn't enjoy it. It was very restricting and stifling for some parents. But I believe they had that opportunity to dip their toes in the water, so to speak, and they enjoyed it. But the thing that surprised me the most was how. And I don't know how to really articulate this well, but how quickly the public education system fell apart in a lockdown situation. It just fell apart. Like school on Zoom, as you were alluding to, was not effective. Completely ineffective.
That's right. If you wanted to homeschool, you would be prepared. You would count the cost. You would say to your husband or wife, if you're a dual parent family, if you're a single parent family as well, you'd count the cost. You would get curriculum, you would sort it out, and you would be very happy to start. But with COVID lockdowns, that was not the case. The schools were unprepared and the parents were unprepared. It was not voluntary. So really, really tough, really tough.
Yeah, I think, and it is. I didn't want to paint that too much like I was saying, you know, this was the public school system's fault. It certainly wasn't. I mean, they were working in a crisis too, you know.
It was very stressful for a lot of the teachers and principals, and at times thankless, you know.
Staff were asked to create online curriculum and they weren't used to that, and it had to be their whole curriculum. And some schools just sent PDF worksheets home, and that was it. So there was again a very level of standard. And again, it's not knocking schools. Those teachers were working overtime at night trying to develop the online stuff for the next day.
Yeah, absolutely.
With what they had. Yeah, with what they had.
Yeah.
So I was gonna ask, like, how do you see the variations and differences? Like, I just want to speak to culture with regards to, let's say, homeschooling in Australia and New Zealand. We obviously have different governments, but we have a different culture. Let's say compared to the United States, and homeschooling over there has become a big thing now. Obviously, with their different presidential candidates, a lot more polarized in politics than we are, at least from our standpoint, and in some cases quite rightly so. But we have Christians and conservatives, you could say, on one side, and I split the two because there is a differentiation there, at least from what I can see. And then we have, let's say people who would just vote, and and then obviously perhaps some extremists on the other. There's extremists on both sides, but we have this concentration of a group of people that would only homeschool. Going back to what you were saying before about that anti-government sentiment, is there a place to obviously pray for government when it comes to your schooling of your kids, but also have a deep mistrust of what perhaps some of us think they're trying to achieve? It may not always be overt, although in some cases now it seems to be. But we see that more. It's a lot more polarized over there than it is here, in the sense that some people are very, very vocal about it. They, federal and state. Obviously, there's a difference between, federal and state. We have federal and state here, but over there, it's just like, this is our state. This is our home. Do not cross this boundary. And we're talking about Christians here. So, how do you see that difference between parents who would homeschool here? Are they for similar reasons as people would, homeschool in the States? And how is it different culture to culture? Because, I mean, we're talking about English language here, but sometimes it's a bit alien,
Yeah. Look, I've done conferences in England. I've done conferences in US and in Asia, actually, some Asian nations. And certainly in the West, you'd have to say the reasons for choosing homeschooling are quite much the same, because largely we're seeing a decline in the Western world in terms of a former Christian emphasis and foundation toward a more atheistic position. It's quite comparable. The US research, there are many more, but it's almost, I think they would now say, according to Dr. Brian Ray, the US would have around about 6% of the student cohort homeschooling. That's massive. But mind you, in Australia and New Zealand, it's growing here too. And as I say, it's very difficult to count the number of kids.
Yeah.
The West, it's interesting. But I've done seminars and conferences in various parts of Asia, and they are doing the same thing. They're doing the same thing. Yeah, so they're homeschooling for similar reasons, and ultimately it can be a push factor that the parents cannot harbour the idea of what an institution wants to inflict, whether it's a religious institution in some Asian countries or an atheistic institution or governmental, and then the pull factor. I want to nurture my child. I want to disciple my child. It's quite simple. Parents are parents.
It's similar, yeah.
What would you say was so? It seems like not only the motivation's the same, not only do we have similar outcomes regardless of socioeconomic, like how much money you make or what area you live in geographically. Would you say that the same applies for when we have successful, or what you might, I don't know what metric you would use, but what we'd consider a successful homeschooling experience and an unsuccessful homeschooling experience? Do you think that those two things are the same no matter where you are? Are there commonalities between why homeschooling has been successful for a family versus unsuccessful?
Hard to say, Cody, because people start for different reasons. For example, in Australian Christian homeschooling, we might have a child who is traumatized psychologically, and they need to, that could be through many reasons. It could be a school-based trauma. It could be a family breakdown trauma. And parents would use homeschooling as an opportunity just to rebuild the child's confidence and that sort of thing. There are other instances where, for example, a family says, we're just going to homeschool and we're going to do it right through to year 12. That's a different group. Then there are the ones who come to us and say, look, my child's 8 and he can't read. And so they're there for academic reasons, for remediation. They might stay homeschooling for 2 years and then pop back into traditional schooling. I remember I was in church once, in a church, I won't say where, but in New South Wales somewhere, and pastor said, oh, come sit up the front. So I sat up the front, and a lady tapped me on the shoulder. She said, oh, you're Terry Harding, aren't you? Yeah. She said, oh, homeschooling, yeah. We had our child who was in year 5, was academically very poor. He was with Australian Christian homeschooling for 2 years and then jumped back into the local high school. He's now the class captain of year 7. So there's remediation, and a big one, which we also find, are disengaged teenagers for whatever reason. It's called school resistance or whatever. They come back and get back on track. So it's very difficult to say why, but as I say, you have people for the long run, people for short-term reasons like 2 or 3 years, and it's great. It's great. We love to be able to serve them and help them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we have the, once it comes back to the parent, once the parent has the sort of responsibility or the lead responsibility of teaching, there's bound to be such a difference in what they focus on, and because there's such a unique control and unique individuals, you're going to have very different outcomes. So I guess it's like almost like churches, churches with statements of faith and churches with they're so varied because they seem to focus on different things.
Their little brick in the wall.
Yeah. And I think that was something that Juliet and I were very drawn to, this idea that we could decide what the minors were and what the majors were,
based on the strengths of your children.
Well, not as you were saying, as you were alluding to earlier, parents being able to identify strengths in their children and focus on those. That's something that definitely drew us. I have a question, when it comes to what, and I know this is a big one, so sorry, Terry. What would be
fire away.
What would be your piece of advice to parents who are considering homeschooling now?
Yeah. I would say if you're two-parent family, get with your husband, your wife, and decide, can we do this? We don't even, and when they're having that conversation, they don't even know what they're talking about at this point in time. They just have an idea that, okay, we're taking the kids out and this is going to cost us big time. Largely the cost will be time. And so just work together as a team with husband and wife. Again, single parent families, you too can do it. And we've got lots of them in ACHS, and I call them the Australian champion educators. They do that. So have a thought, think about it, talk to someone who's doing it, or call us. We've had plenty of experience, but someone who's done it, like you've got Australian Christian Homeschooling, there's Home Education Australia, HEA. There are people near you, wherever you are in Australia, that have experience. So talk with them. Next, I would say, as a Christian guy, I'd be saying, step out in faith, have a go, and you'll be very pleased. And then to not be too hard on yourself, especially when you start. You are only learning. You'll be okay. No one's going to die. It'll be fine. And you will grow in your experience. It's just interesting. See, we have a number of parents in ACHS that are trained teachers, and people ask me, well, what's the difference between a mum and a dad? Mum's not trained teacher, and you've got this lady over here who's done primary-based education for 5 or 6 years. The answer is there's no difference in terms of starting. Both of them say, whoa, this is big. This is going to be hard. The only difference is the trained teacher says, well, once I get in, I know my way around. But I find both the experienced teacher and the non-experienced person, both are hesitant. And I just say, relax, have a go. And if you're a praying person, just trust the Lord. Just trust the Lord and have a go. So there you go. From our point of view, what we like to do is, that is in Australian Christian homeschooling, we'll diagnose the child for maths, for English, for reading and spelling, and we'll place them in a curriculum at the appropriate success level where they can actually start learning from day one.
Fantastic.
But don't be afraid to remediate your child. Just because they're 8 years old doesn't mean they should be doing year 3. They could be higher level, lower level. You have to find that out. Our youngest year 12 graduates were 12-year old. They were both they were twins. They were twins. They were the youngest entrants into a Queensland university, which will go unnamed, and they both finished their degree at age 18.
Yeah.
So that's pretty outstanding.
That's pretty outstanding.
It's all I'm saying is have a go. It's flexible. You'll be surprised at what you learn and how it happens.
On the back end of what Cody was saying there, with regards to how can parents get involved in homeschooling, so what percentage is two things I'm thinking of, and they're very brief questions, but what would you say, roughly speaking, percentage wise, within your organisation? You have families that aren't strictly Christian. They may be conservative, but they're just pro-science, whatever. What percentage actually do you have who aren't necessarily of a religious background in your organisation?
Yeah, 50-50.
Wow.
50-50. Yeah. People like the idea of values and to have their children learn about right and wrong.
I can't believe those numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, I can believe those numbers, but I'm just like, that's really striking to hear that half of all the families that you have aren't also not happy with the direction of schooling in the public or private sector in Australia. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, well, I can remember back in the late 90s having a party with our staff here at ACHS because we were celebrating our first family from a non-Christian but religious background. And
so
I won't say which one, but we just celebrate with. And I spoke to the dad and said, well, why would you be picking up this Christian curriculum? He said, because I want the values. I want the values, the goodness, and what we teach is character traits. We teach 60 character developments of Jesus, such as the characteristic of creativity, punctual, on time, honesty. 60 of those, and we built that into the teaching.
Yeah, awesome.
So people want that for their kids, and who wouldn't? Who wouldn't, irrespective of their religious background?
Coming back to what I was saying, I believe that when you're able to sit parents down and have that logical conversation, I think that they would come to that conclusion. Yes, we want our kids to learn. Yes, we'd like them to learn at their own pace, with their own strengths and weaknesses and everything in between. The other part of what I was going to ask you was just with regards to this boom in homeschooling. What opportunities, I guess, does it present for individuals to get involved in organisations, perhaps individuals who are passionate about it, who perhaps aren't necessarily from a teaching background, i.e., I can imagine a lot of the individuals who work within your organisation come from a teaching background, qualifications, etc. But what sort of opportunities sort of are in this sphere with regards to associations or organisations to who are people who are passionate about seeing kids thrive outside of public or private education within homeschooling to actually help with this newfound flourishing?
Well, the major qualification is someone who loves children and wants to help families to flourish in freedom. That's about it. We have staff who are trained teachers, and we have staff who are not. But the key is you need to have a love for people and a desire to help people out of problems, because people come to us often really worried. What can I do? I have no answer. And to be able to provide an answer, a simple answer, and to hold their hand as they enter into the challenge is very, very satisfying. So I guess to answer your question, we want people that are empathetic, freedom loving and empathetic, flexible.
Yeah, I reckon I'm going to get the last question, Jace.
You get the last one in?
Can I get the last question?
Are we finishing up, are we?
Oh, we definitely have to.
Terry's got a lot more to
No. Well, Terry, so I will say, you wouldn't be opposed to the opportunity of coming on again and discussing homeschooling again, would you? I have so many more questions, but
I don't think we can cover it all in one evening.
we genuinely can't.
I'd love to.
Yeah,
do fish swim? I love to.
Fantastic. Well, I usually do this to my guests. I've actually interviewed a few people regarding homeschooling in the last few months, and 3 people separately, and I've had wonderful experiences. And once those are made public, I'll let you see them. They actually mention you. 2 of them know you, and one of them works in a school. So either way, I'm sure you'll enjoy that. But I put all of them on the spot with this one question, and I'm going to do the same with you. So
Yeah, sure.
What is the gospel? What is the gospel?
The gospel is good news. And the good news is that God has sent his Son to take the sins of the world, to take the sins upon themselves within him, and through death pay the death cost that was to be delivered to all people. So in other words, Jesus took our sin upon himself that we might be forgiven, cleansed, and become part of God's family. And it's free. I cannot earn it. I cannot be favoured in God because of all the good things I do. That's not the case. God gives it as a free gift that's called grace. So there's much more to it, but anybody can enter into God's family, into forgiveness, cleansing, freedom, and a relationship with him by just turning to him and saying, God, I want you, forgive me, make me part of you, part of your family. So,
Amen.
That's a great
answer.
answer.
That's a beautiful answer. Yeah. Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much.
I like you got that. You got that. It's got that kind of Matt Walshism going on. What is a woman? What is the gospel? That's a great answer. That was a great answer.
No, my intention is after we do quite a few of these is to string them together in a compilation, and it's going to be.
He wants to see the consistency.
Yeah, and not just the consistency, but
the lack of consistency.
The joy. And what is education? Education is life. The communication of life from the living to the living. And parents are doing it, but the parents who aren't Christian, if you're listening to this today and you're not a Christian, look, you just need to realize that you're made up of a body, a soul, and a spirit. So too are your kids. And you need that spiritual connection, fed and growing and connected to God, who's a spirit. However, as a spirit, he sent his Son in the flesh to become a man, and he knows the ways of humanity, even to the point of death, which he died for you and for me.
Amen.
And I'm so grateful. You talk about New Zealand. I became a Christian on a surfing trip in 1976.
On a surfing
in
trip.
New Zealand. Yep, third day. I went for 2 months to surf around there with a hitchhike with a surfboard and a backpack.
Nice.
And the Lord
Was that
guided me
70s?
The gospel on the third day.
Was that 70s? 1970s?
Amen.
76, yeah.
Wow. Okay. What was New Zealand about like back in 76? I wasn't even born yet, so.
Okay. Very, very focused to their dairies. We call them milk bars here.
Oh yeah, dairies.
Ice
Yeah,
cream
dairies.
and
Yeah.
chocolate chip bars that were that thick and
Tip top ice cream, hokey pokey. Yeah, love it. Love it.
hokey pokey.
Oh,
I couldn't
man,
believe
live.
it when I write.
My dad still talks about it. Yeah.
I'm religious when it comes to ice cream and hokey pokey. It's the only anyway. Terry, it's been absolutely fabulous having you on, and I agree with Cody. We haven't even scratched the surface. There's actually a lot of other things that I've thought of as we've gone along that pertain to like stats and interesting. I actually really like the stats and getting into all the intricacies because they really shed light on the overall state of the education system, but also the beauty of what can come from homeschooling. But perhaps next time we can talk about how a bit more about, I guess, how parents can get involved into homeschooling, because I think really, at least for us, when we got Elijah for the last about 2.5 years of his schooling, actually out of a Christian school, funnily enough. It was a little bit scary to start with. So perhaps that will be a topic we can discuss next time at a later date to be confirmed. But thank you so much for coming on. We're really honoured to have you on and taking your time on a Friday night away from your own family. And also driving back to your office and having internet at home. So we also had our own little difficulties. So that was big of you to do that for us. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Terry.
It's my pleasure, guys. Great to meet, and goodbye to everybody, and God bless you. Thank you.
For next time.
Bye.